have returned. Please be seated. The court will recall people of the state of Colorado v. Nathan Woodyard, 21 CR 2794. The parties and counsel are present. Next witness for the people.
Thank you, Your Honor. The people first witness this morning is Officer Harrison.
It's always fair word for testimony about the Right, thank you. If you'll tell us your name and then spell your last name.
Sure. It's Kevin Smith, S-M-Y-T-H.
Your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. And now, Officer Smith, could you move that microphone up a little bit and get it as close and comfortable
How's
as
that?
you could there? Great, thank you. Could you please start by explaining to the jury what your job is?
Yeah, I'm a sergeant with the Aurora Police Department. My current assignment is over training. So I'm a supervisor for the training unit, which includes basic and lateral academies. So basic is somebody who's never been a cop before. A lateral academy is a cop who is moving from another department. Sorry. Basic is somebody who's never been a police officer before. Lateral academy is an officer who's moving from one department to ours. It also covers all the in-service curriculum. So all of the officers that we have to do ongoing training every year. We run all of that training. I'm also the training records manager for the training unit. So I manage all of the files. I keep them. I do the discovery requests and certify those records.
Great. And could I ask you, as best as you're able, to try and slow down?
I'm going to do my best. I am a fast talker.
I know. You and I are both fast talkers and talk a lot, so we'll try and control each other a little bit here.
All right. Fair
So
enough.
first, the supervisor of the training academy. How long have you been doing that?
Since 2021.
Okay. How about your role as a trainer at the academy? When did you first start doing that?
Yes. So I first became an instructor for the department in 2010. And then in 2013, I transitioned from patrol into as a full-time instructor at the academy in 2013. And I was the lead arrest control and self-defense instructor for the department at that time.
What did you do before getting involved in full-time teaching in 2013?
So I was a patrol officer, and I had worked the road. So I did everything that our cops do for about 5 years. I was also on the ERT team, emergency response team, and they handle civil incidents and big issues and stuff. So I did that as an ancillary job in that time period as well.
Okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about your role with maintaining the training records and the documents for the department. What exactly do you do in that role?
So the department has policies in place to retain records for training. Obviously, we want to maintain all of those. So there are policies in place that tell us what we need to keep, how long we need to keep it, and then those are stored on a file serve. And so part of my job is to maintain that file and ensure that that's kind of protected. And then the other part of that role is to produce those documents when needed. And the occasions that we would need to produce those are for like a discovery request. There's a lawsuit where they need documents. We need to produce those. There's like what we call CORA requests, C-O-R-A, Open Records Act. If a person just says, hey, I want to see the PD's training, we produce those. And then any internal investigations as well for IA or force investigations units or those kind of things. So anybody who asks for those records, we would do those. And occasionally that would be also certifying those records. So you're swearing under oath that these records are accurate to the best of our record keeping.
So does the Aurora Police Department try and track who has attended the different trainings?
Yes.
Do you keep like attendance logs or sheets or Excel spreadsheets?
Yes, there'd be, depending on the time of year, or not time of year, but the era we're in, technology has changed a lot over the last few years. So we can have anything from a written, we call it like a blue ink or a wet ink signature page where somebody comes in and signs in, all the way up to using a learning management system. And that would be something that where we would electronically take a roll call and put people in. So we rely on both of those new and old technologies, even to today.
Okay. Do you also try and keep copies of training slides or PowerPoint presentations that are actually given to different officers?
Yes, we want to maintain what was taught in the class, any of the PowerPoints, the lesson plan, what's produced or given as resources or handouts. So we would retain all of those in those classes.
You mentioned some of the purposes of those training logs. Can they also be important for the Peace Officer Standards and Trainings Board?
Yes, one of the other things that we have to do is we report for the officers all of the hours that they have annually that they're required to take for the state. The state certifies police officers, and part of that requirement is to do ongoing training. And so we have a portal that we put those hours into. And so it's very important that those hours are correct. And so we rely on those training records to be accurate so that we can report accurately to the state on behalf of the officers that are certified.
Okay. That state board that certifies police officers, what is that called and what's their role relative to what you do?
Yeah, it's called POST, and it's Police Officer Standards and Training. It is directed by the Attorney General and a board of community members and law enforcement. And then that board decides what is required to be a police officer and what is required to stay a police officer.
Okay. Now, in your role as a full-time instructor and as overseeing the academy, do you do a lot of training yourself?
Do I receive training?
Do you personally provide training?
So yeah, yes to both. I receive a lot of training myself, and I also teach a lot of the courses that are specifically in the areas of, arrest control, self-defense, in those areas.
Okay. Do you have broad familiarity with the whole curriculum, or are you just specified in those areas?
No, in my role as an academy instructor, the classes are very big and usually, and so it takes a lot of instructors. So we're all very familiar with the curriculum throughout the entire like basic academy curriculum. But then as a supervisor, I also am very aware of all the training materials that are presented. We have an approval process, and I'm a part of that process of approving the training before it gets delivered as well. So I have good knowledge of the breadth of training, department-wide and in basic academies.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that for the last decade, your entire professional focus has been on training and the academy?
That'd be fair, yeah.
Your Honor, at this point in time, the people would offer Mr. Smith as an expert in the area of the Aurora Police Department's training and policies.
Woodyard or objection?
Objection, Judge.
All right, the court will, based upon the foundation, allow the witness to explain concepts to the jury in that area and opine in that area.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to give the jury an idea of how a regular police officer is trained. So can you start first by just giving them an idea of what the basic academy for a new officer looks like?
Sure. We have to mention that it starts long before they start the academy. So there's a vetting process, right? There's a bunch of backgrounds that has to occur, and there's a bunch of psychological evaluations, physical evaluations. So there's a whole process that goes before to vet folks that go into the academy. When they get to the academy, it is a very rigid and standardized curriculum and process. When an academy in the state of Colorado presents an academy, it's actually has to be post approved. So the post board has to approve that academy. They say, here's the hours, here's the classes, here's the lesson plans. They dig into every little piece. And so when a police department is running an academy or a community college is running an academy, it is actually a post academy. You are representing the post board in that approval process. And so everything that you're taught is done through that process, which means you have to attend 100% of everything. So you cannot graduate unless we show record that you have attended everything. If you're gone one day, we have to show a makeup if you do that. And we also cannot deviate from that curriculum without notifying the post board. So if there is, we can't just do whatever we want. We have to do what we submitted. If there is a fundamental change in the middle of it, say like the law changes in the middle of the class, we would update post to make sure. So those are very regimented, and once we sort of submit that, it becomes sort of kind of the plan and playbook that we run.
Okay. How about the duration of the academy? How long does that run?
Yeah, our academies typically run about 6 months. They're generally depending on what year, they're almost double in most cases. So we do, there's a state minimum, and we're generally 2 times what the state minimum is for our academies.
Do you mean that the academy the APD provides has twice as many hours of training as the minimum required by the state?
Around twice as many. It depends on the year. It depends on post adjust its hours. We adjust our hours. But yes, in general, we are usually around double the amount of hours. Yes.
Great. After a recruit goes through the initial 6-month academy, and assuming they become a full-time officer with the Aurora Police Department, is that the end of their training, or do they have ongoing training?
No, there's a lot more to it. So the graduating the academy is just sort of the beginning. Every police officer in Colorado has to do some sort of FTO program. And so,
Sorry.
sorry.
FTO, can you explain?
Sorry. Thank you. FTO is like a field training, right? It's kind of on the job training. They're typically sworn, they are on the road with a senior officer, and they do that. Now, every department has different qualifications, and that's not as rigid, but Aurora has a very standard practice of an FTO program that we don't allow new graduates from the academy to be on their own until we're absolutely sure that they have met everything. And that also includes like extending folks who need more time or need more training. And so that's there even after FTO. So now you've graduated FTO.
Sorry,
Yes, sorry.
I just want to flesh out this FTO process a little
Sure.
bit more. You indicated that it's pretty rigid and that you don't let people move on until they've demonstrated some proficiency. Are there some minimum or maximum times someone goes through the FTO process, or is there a rough average?
There's a minimum amount of times. And again, it depends on sort of the time frame. So not speaking specifically to one period in time, but it can be anywhere from like 3 to 4 months, up to 6 months, depending on kind of where those, how the FTO program is designed at the time.
Okay.
And so, but there's stages. They usually go through, a stage 1 where they're just sort of like learning kind of the ropes and stuff. And then stage 2, they're kind of being evaluated. Stage 3, they're much more scrutiny. And then there's a test out phase where basically they run for several weeks as an individual unit with an FTO in the car. And so there's a test out. If they miss those marks, they can be extended in any one of those phases, and then either moved on or separated, or they can also choose to leave the department if they find that it's not for them.
Okay. So in addition to this FTO or field training officer sort of mentorship supervision program, is there continuing classroom education that every officer is required to do?
Yes, once you graduate the academy, you're now a police officer. You're required to do ongoing training. Now, most of the time, academies are not, any recent graduate is not, because you just got done with, 1,000 hours, you don't need to turn in any more that calendar year to post. But once you catch the next, the beginning cycle, January 1, you're in a new cycle, so you are required to do that as a state. However, that's the state requirement. Aurora has always had mandatory training for every officer in those roles as well. So Aurora has a mandated training. We use that mandated training to submit some hours to post. It's usually significantly more than the minimum for the state. But the officers are required to do that every year of their career for the rest of the time they're sworn.
Okay. Are those the in-service trainings that APD does?
We call that in-service. So when we use the term in-service, it would be for an incumbent officer, someone who's already sworn, coming back for training inside the department.
Okay. How often do those in-service trainings happen for the officers?
It's all over the board. We typically shoot for 40 hours a year, but with COVID, that we got 40 hours, but they didn't come back for it. A lot of that was online. But then when we, like now, I think this year, I think the average officer is doing over 100 hours of training, just because of all the mandates that we have with new systems and stuff. So it varies year to year. We typically will do it in quarters. And so the average officer would come back at a minimum of 40 hours a year in quarters. That's not including all of their individual jobs. So a detective has to do this 40 hours, but they also have to do job specific training. So it's a lot.
Okay. Now, these quarterly in-service trainings that you mentioned, are there certain topics that are always covered or sometimes covered? How's that decided?
Yeah, we had a credentialing that required certain things. So it's a affiliation and accreditation with a national agency, and that national agency says your policies are in line. And when we had those, they mandated things every year. We also have internal policies that say these are the things that have to be covered every year or every 2 years or every 3 years. And so we have to maintain all of those mandates from external and internal. There's also post mandates, especially in the most recent, probably about 6-7 years ago, post was mandating certain ongoing training that had to be done every 5 years. And so there are things that we have to do every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, every 5 years. And then it's our job to make sure that our officers get all of those.
Okay. So if I'm missing anything, let me know. But it sounds like every patrol officer needs to go through the 6-month academy. They've got those quarterly in-service trainings of at least 40 hours of training a year.
Mhm.
They do the field training officer for 3 to 6 months. And then if there's any job specific training specific to their assignment, those would all be the required things that they have to do.
Yes.
Can they also seek additional certifications to be instructors or have other specialized techniques?
Oh, yes. So anything that you want to specialize in, there are patrol specialties, there's investigative specialties. You can go and do that. For instance, in my world, I did several instructor certificates for arrest control, self-defense, use of force, and then applied those to my track, which was a kind of a trainer track. But you kind of, depending on where you're assigned and what you're interested in and where your career development goes, you would have other requirements to do those things.
Okay. Is one of those additional optional certifications to become a KOGA arrest control instructor?
Yeah, KOGA is the name of our arrest control system. So you'll hear terms like KOGA, ACT, which is arrest control tactics. So it's the system we use to put handcuffs on people and to search people. That's the kind of the ACT side of it. And then there's also sort of the self-defense side. And so, yes, you can become a KOGA instructor. We have 3 disciplines. There's like the ACT, which is handcuffing and searching, overcoming resistance. There is the self-defense, where I'm protecting myself or somebody else from physical assaults and weapons. And then there's like some of our intermediate with our baton. And so you could come to any one or all 3 of those to be an instructor in those areas.
Okay. I'd like to break down some of those words a little bit. You mentioned KOGA is the system that you used. Where does that name KOGA come from?
Yeah, the Koga Institute was founded by Bob Koga. Bob Koga is internationally known as probably the premier arrest control, use of force expert. He's now deceased, but his institute is still going. But Aurora has been, the Koga Institute was founded with Bob Koga in the late 60s, early 70s, and then kind of more formalized late 70s. Aurora has a history with that arrest control system as early as like 77, 78. And so
When you say an arrest control system, do you mean the different techniques that KOGA teaches in order to execute arrests and control?
that's correct. Yeah. And those systems, so how you do that have to be approved by the state as well. And so not only does your overall curriculum, but the state has a say over whether or not your arrest control system is approved or not. You can't just make something up and then, start teaching whatever you want in one of their basic academies, because again, these are post basic academies. So KOGA, the FBI has a federal one that a lot of departments use, and then there's PPCT or Human Factors Research Group, and those are the 3 state-approved systems. So POST says if you're going to do these systems, you have to do them the way that they teach. You have to submit those, and then you can do that. Otherwise, you have to make up your own system and then submit the whole thing for approval so that officers in the state of Colorado are not doing things that aren't approved.
Sure. So it sounds like it's a pretty standardized process, both in APD and also in your relationship with POST, to the Peace Officer Standards and Training Board.
Absolutely.
Now, I want to talk about all these different things that we talked about here. Did Mr. Woodyard graduate from APD's Basic Academy?
He did.
Did he complete all of the quarterly in-service for the years that he was employed by APD?
Yes.
Did he also seek that additional certification as a KOGA arrest control instructor?
Yes.
And was he successful in getting certified as an instructor?
As an assistant instructor, yes.
I'd like to talk now about some of the specific trainings that the Aurora Police Department does. First, starting with the carotid control hold training. How often are Aurora police officers trained on how to use the carotid?
So you get a significant block in your basic academy. That's kind of certifies you to use the technique. And there is also, once you're done, there's a mandate to be have training in that particular technique every year. So that's one of our policy issues, is our policy says that you have to be certed in that technique every year or trained in that technique every year. The training may be different year to year, but we do see some sort of training in that technique, throughout your career.
Okay. So an officer would get initially trained on the carotid in the academy, is that right?
That's right.
And then some form of training through in-service every year in the carotid after that?
Yes.
Now, the carotid training in particular, the testing process, is it different from how other arrest control tactics are tested?
It is.
Can you explain to the jury how it's different?
So if it's done improperly, the risks go much higher. And so because of those risks, we have a different standard for testing than we do in other techniques. The techniques like putting a handcuff off, or making sure you're using the correct hand positioning in a search. Those are a little less, have less risks if you do it incorrectly. With the carotid, we want to make sure that it's done exactly the way it's trained every time. And so that has 100% standard, which means in any other test, you can get either 70% or 80%, and it's a passing grade. In that particular technique, in the way that we set it up, it has 100% pass-fail. You fail one part of it, you fail the entire test. The written test is also designed where it's not just multiple choice, it's actually, you have to write something out. We need you to know what the information is instead of just eliminating it from a choice of ABC, right? So that's a higher standard. And then our testing is, so there's the practical test that's 100%, and the written test is also 100%. The written test also is a short answer or, essay answer version of a test. And so we want to make sure that the officers trained in that technique know their stuff.
You mentioned that although the carotid is 100% necessary to pass, many of the other techniques are, a more, as long as you basically understand it, as I think you said 70 or 80% would be sufficient. Can you describe some of those other use of force techniques that would be tested on that other scale of just, we want to make sure that you're basically understanding it?
Yeah, it'd be helpful to understand how our testing works in those physical techniques, right? So that we have a technique to do something physically, and it isn't just something on a piece of paper. So it's a bit subjective to the instructor, but we need to make it consistent. So on all other techniques, we use what's called a pass, a pin, PIN, and a fail. A pass means you know the technique. So show me how to put handcuffs on this person. And we have a specific way we want the officers to do that. And that would be a pass. They're good. If they do the technique, they know it. They've got the most part, but it isn't the most clean, or it could be just a little bit better. We have the pin, which is pass improvement needed. So it's good, but you need to work on it. That's kind of where that pin is. And then there's a failure of the technique where if you were to lose control of the person, or you just don't know the technique, that would be a hard fail. And so with the pass, pin, fail, you can have, this was an excellent demonstration, this was good enough, this was not good in everything. With a carotid, we don't have pin. It's pass or it's fail. And then a failure of one part of the test is a failure of the entire test. And then you have to do the whole thing over again.
Okay.
In remediation.
Can you give some examples of some other uses of force where the pass in need of improvement would be part of the curriculum and an okay way to pass?
Yeah. So if I'm standing behind someone, we want, like when we're searching, we put someone in a position of disadvantage, right? And so that the officer has time. And so if the officer is not in the perfect position, if they don't put the person in the perfect position, that would be something like, you're good, you have it, you have the mechanics, it will work, but there's ways that you could make that better. If I'm doing, say, we teach officers, if someone's pointing a gun and it's really close to you, how to do a gun takeaway. And so that's something that's very dynamic, and you have to move very quickly. The officer may get that just slightly out of order, but if it works and they don't, they don't get shot and they don't point the gun at themselves in the process, then it works, because self-defense, there's no wrong in self-defense. I mean, good enough is, as long as you sort of have something and it's good, that's sort of where we draw that line. There are certain techniques that require much more precision, and then there's certain techniques that the only other thing is, okay, I'm going to do a takedown and we will push here at the elbow, but their hand is a little higher up. Well, it still will work, but it's better if it's here, not here. And that would be kind of the difference between, like that perfect and the pass. It's good enough, it'll work, but you can do a little better.
Okay. Now, would it be fair to say that of all the arrest control techniques that are taught by the Aurora Police Department, of any one technique, is the most training time spent on the carotid?
If we were to break it down to, there's like 100 and it also depends on the year. We're going back a ways. I know we're talking. There's like 130 to 180 techniques on a list that an officer needs to know in our academy. And so depending on those, if we were to break it down to how much time do you spend on this one, how much time do you spend on this one, we would spend more time on the carotid than any one particular technique in the academy. The arrest control program is like anywhere between 132 to 150 hours in general over the last decade. It's about that. Again, it's well over double the amount for the state. But that particular technique, just to give you an example, in the basic curriculum is usually like 6 hours. And so that's more time spent on that one particular technique than any other. don't mean to say it's a more important technique than anything else we learn, but because it's so important that you do it the way you're trained and you do it correctly, it's safe when you do it right. But if you don't do it right, the risks go up. And so we want to make sure that our officers are competent and confident that they can do it correctly. And we as a department need to make sure they can do it as well.
What I think I hear you saying is that it's not the most commonly used technique, that these other 100 and so often get used more, but you spend so much time on it because of the risks if it's not done properly?
That's correct. Yeah, yes.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some of the specific training then, Officer Smith. Could we please show the witness Exhibit 200, please? And for the record, this is dates pages 22293 and the following ones. And now let's scroll forward a couple of pages just to let Officer Smith take a look at this.
Can you go back one slide just quick?
Yeah. Officer Smith, is this a copy of a carotid control hold training and the notes for the speaker that you presented?
Yes. Can you go to the next slide? I'm just looking for something to determine the next slide, please. Yes. So this is a PowerPoint with speaker notes that was delivered in 2019 for a in-service curriculum. So incumbent officers coming back for that annual training. This is the PowerPoint that was used for that training in 2019.
Okay. Would this have been part of one of those in-service programs that everybody in the department went through?
Yes.
And did you review the Excel sign-in sheets to confirm that Mr. Woodyard took this class?
Yes.
Did he take it about 10 days before the incident involving Elijah McClain in August?
I'm sorry, I don't know the math on the date, so I don't know how to answer that, but it falls very closely, but I don't know.
Okay.
I can't answer affirmatively to that.
How do the speaker notes relate to what is on the slides here?
The speaker notes are a couple of different things. One, an instructor, we don't want to do death by PowerPoint. So if we wrote everything on the slide, it would just be completely murder for a person to have to sit and listen to that. But we do have to make sure that that information is communicated so that any instructor that's in the room is saying the same thing no matter what class you're in. And then we also have to be able to discover this information. We have to be able to prove that this is what was said. And so we rely on that information was covered in those dates. And so we use the PowerPoint is what you see, and what's in the speaker note is what is said. And that's our way of capturing what's said in those. Or at least I should say the minimum of what needs to be said.
So somebody who is doing the training would definitely communicate everything written on the slide and in the notes, but might also add additional information. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's instructors that can have more experience or can add, expertise.
19 in-service class.
It is the PowerPoint that was sent out on the LMS prior to the training, and the same PowerPoint that slides were used in the in-seat training. And I don't know if that might be important because of this particular in-service.
Sure. So this was both sent out to all the participants electronically to review? Is that what you're saying? So
part of the curriculum was, again, this would have been kind of right in the middle of when we were having difficulty getting people in for training. And then also we have a new LMS, which allowed us to deliver training, learning management system. It allows us to deliver training electronically. And so the way that curriculum was set up for that year, for that technique, was to send this PowerPoint out to every officer. Every officer reviewed the PowerPoint. They got signed off on it. The LMS makes sure that they spent the time, that they clicked through each slide, that they read everything. And then when they come into class, we would do a quick review off the same PowerPoint and then just hitting certain slides. And then they were doing the practical test. So it was a way to be more efficient, but it was, you got the training through the PowerPoint here. You were required to read everything. You were required to go through that. The LMS ensured that you did that. And then you came in we hit particular slides and particular notes on slides, and then we went into the practical test. So it's just a way to be more efficient with manpower.
Great. And is this a copy of those slides that you were just referring to from this training?
So this looks like a copy of the slides that were used in the online version. There's another set of slides that would be what was taught. We hid certain slides because you didn't need to cover that again in the actual in-seat, but it would have been the same PowerPoint.
Okay, great. I'd move for admission of Peoples 200.
Questions or objections with respect to 200? 200 will be admitted.
Permission to publish to the jury, Your Honor.
You may.
Let's start off on page 3.
Not working.
Looks like our projector might need its coffee this morning too.
Okay. Here we go.
All right. So here's just the title slide for it. Could we go to page 3, please? Can you please explain to the jury how Aurora police officers are trained to apply the carotid?
So the carotid control hold is a neck restraint, and its design is to put pressure on the sides of the person's neck. And what that does is it temporarily restricts the flow of oxygenated blood to the brain and renders the person unconscious. The technical term is syncope. And so it's a very quick, rapid way in most people to just render them unconscious to be able to get control. This slide here is just what we start to introduce the subject of, like, where we want the pressure. It makes a difference where that pressure is applied, and we want to officers to understand that that's what is occurring in this technique.
Okay. Are they trained that the idea is to put pressure on the blood veins and arteries to the side rather than on the front of the throat?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And if members of the jury just kind of put their fingers there, is that where you feel your pulse, the area they're supposed to be applying pressure?
Yeah, the pulse that you're feeling is the vein and artery that we are attempting to use pressure on.
How about physically? What is the officer supposed to be doing with their arms to apply the hold?
Yeah, so the officer's arm is around the person's neck. They're generally behind the person. The sides, the bicep, and the forearm are putting pressure on there. And the front part of the throat is right in the middle where kind of the inside of the elbow is. And so the way that the body works mechanically is that I can put pressure this way and not putting any pressure on the front or sides of the throat. We make a significant distinction between putting pressure on the sides of the throat, and then if I were to move and put my forearm on the front of the throat, which is called a bar arm choke, that is where we would make that differentiation. But so the bicep of the officer and the forearm, it can be done with either arm, would be putting pressure on the sides.
I'm glad that you mentioned the choke situation. Can we go to slide 6? That was the next thing I wanted to ask you about. Are the officers trained that lay people or people who aren't familiar with arrest control tactics often confuse a choke hold and a carotid hold?
Yes, this is a pretty significant, it's a pretty significant nuance. And if you don't understand, this is where the confusion comes in. From a distance, it almost looks virtually the same. It's almost kind of impossible to sort of tell whether or not one is the other. But we want the officers to be keenly aware of that. We also know that people come in with different experiences, and MMA or jujitsu or any sort of ground grappling uses both techniques in the dojos every day. We don't want officers coming in with any prior. Am I talking too fast or am I getting away from the mic? Okay, both. Okay. Okay, so MMA is mixed martial arts fighting, jujitsu. We know that both of those techniques are used indiscriminately in sport every day in the dojos. We don't want officers confusing those who have some experience with that. And we also want officers who don't have experience to know the difference between them. And this is the significant difference between doing it correctly and doing it incorrectly, because we can cause injury if we don't do it right.
Are you also training the officers to make sure that they're using the right terms, carotid instead of choke, because that's a common mistake that people make?
Yes, because of the nuance of the language, most people in general, the public, just think a choke is a choke is a choke, or those kind of things. And because the term choke is used because it's occluding airway. So if you think of, if you've been around long enough, to carburetors were a thing, the choke on the carburetor closed the airway. And that's the difference between a choke and then like a neck restraint that's like a vascular neck restraint, or something that temporarily restricts the flow of blood, right? So those are the difference. And so we teach the officers that you are not to use the term choke in your report. We don't even want it in our common language. And we even say we don't even want that term in the locker room as you're talking about it, right? We don't want the street term for things to be mixed with a professional police officer who is using a technique in a manner that they're trained to do.
I appreciate that. Could we take a look at slide 9, please? And let's focus just on the slide itself to start with. Are you training officers here about the dangers that the carotid can pose if used inappropriately?
Yes, we talk about the risks.
Okay. Now, here, one of the risks is talking about the dangers of brain damage or death due to deprivation of oxygenated blood for a minute. Do you teach them as well the medical term for that, hypoxia?
We don't teach that term per se. I think some are aware of that term, but we don't teach that term there. But we do talk about timeframes that are involved, where this comes from, where that actual number comes from. We give them an indicator of why we're using that timeframe, and the risks that are involved if we do it incorrectly.
Are these risks the reason why the carotid is trained every year and with such exactitude?
Yes, we want to ensure that officers have regular, consistent, ongoing training on a technique that, if it isn't done correctly, can create more risks.
Okay. Let's take a look at slide 12, the whole thing, please. Now here, are you training officers not to use the carotid more than once on somebody?
No, what we're training in this is that we want to avoid repeated applications to the same person over and over and over and over and over to the same person. And the second half is just, once somebody goes unconscious, we don't want to continue to render them unconscious. They wake up, render them unconscious, wake up. It's kind of the risks go up when we either repeatedly reply it or we continue to do it over and over to someone who has been rendered unconscious.
Well, let's talk about that first paragraph there. In the last sentence, it looks like you're training the officers that with each application, it's possible for the risks to increase. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, do you also talk here down in the third paragraph about the importance of releasing the hold and releasing the use of force? What do you train officers about that?
So we train that when you put the application on, that we train the officers to give orders to the person so that, because the goal is voluntary compliance. The goal is to get the person to, do what we want them to do. And so we train them to like say something like, show me your hands, put up your hands, that kind of language. And then we would say, if they're getting that compliance, then de-escalate the control, take the pressure off, get them into control because we have compliance. The other thing that is that we don't want to continue holding it when we know they're unconscious or they're unable to resist at that point. And then we would want to make sure that they transition to that control. So the goal being ultimately getting control of the person, i.e. putting them in handcuffs and, getting them what they need.
Okay. And that idea that you mentioned about somebody, gets the carotid, then is put into handcuffs and is under control, is that what you're training them in this last sentence here? That remember the application of unnecessary force after the suspect has complied or is incapable of complying is excessive force. Is that what you're training them to back off?
I missed the question. Yes, that's what it says. What was your question?
Sure. Is this talking about a situation where the carotid has already been applied and somebody is already in handcuffs and is either complying or incapable of complying due to their medical condition?
Yeah, it could be viewed as excessive force, yes. Mhm.
Well, not to be clear, not could be viewed as, but it is excessive force if you're continuing to apply.
Yeah, if you are in that situation where you are doing that, yes.
Let's talk next about page 15. This training. Now, one of the things mentioned here is that it's in the second paragraph is where I'm talking about. It's imperative that the officer check for coherency. Why do you train officers that that's so important?
So we train for checking for coherency once the person is like, once they've regained consciousness. The coherency is there's a very slight risk of stroke or stroke-like symptoms in these cases. And so what we want to do is just make sure that the person is able to sort of communicate, that they're talking, that we don't have kind of that risk. And so what we want to do is when somebody is rendered unconscious in this way, the brain takes a few seconds to sort of put everything back online. And what we want the officers to do is recognize that, hey, there's this 30-second window that people are going to be sort of dazed, confused, not maybe, saying anything. But at 30 seconds, after they've regained consciousness, we want to see if they are at least answering questions. So there's no specific script. You ask questions, what day of the week is it? Who's the president? What's your middle name? I mean, any kind of questions will do. And what we're looking for is, one, are they understanding us? Two, are they putting together sentences and words? And then three, are we looking at any signs of like, a drooping face or something that would indicate some sort of a stroke emergency? And that would give us an indicator of like, we need to, treat this as that kind of an emergency.
I want to talk about sort of two aspects of this. One is what are you training officers the difference between coherency versus just ability to talk is?
Well, I think that we train to look for the symptoms. And when we're talking about stroke-like symptoms, we're referring back to first aid training, right? How to recognize that someone's having that. So we're sort of referencing that particular when the coherency check is to screen in a very basic first aid way for that particular sign or symptom. So that's what we're referencing. That's what we're trying to talk and look for. I don't know that we go into the differences between someone who is talking and not, but a person who is giving full sentences, a person who is saying words has a thing. If those words are coming out and it's not sounding like, in a stroke, sometimes part of the body starts losing function. And so you'll start to get kind of a slur in the speech. And that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. Again, referencing first aid, which is what we look for in those type of situations. Those are the things that they're searching for specifically in that
Yeah.
coherency.
You mentioned specifically searching for slurred speech. Is the other thing that they're trained to search for just responsiveness, actually answering questions that they're asked?
Yeah, that's one of the things, yeah, that can be an indicator. And so,
The second thing I wanted to talk to you about is the second half of this paragraph. It says, if within 30 seconds, the absence of ability to understand and respond to these types of questions could signal a medical emergency. Are you training them that like 30 seconds, that's when you got to check? Or is this training to say all the time after 30 seconds, this is when we should be paying attention to this?
I think it's a dynamic and fluid process. What we're trying to do is give some sort of a marker that if the person's not like online in that 30 seconds, that might signal something, right? That might say this could be something. There are cases where somebody is 32 seconds and then answering the questions, or 40 seconds and then answering the questions. But we want to give some sort of indicator to the to the officer that, yeah, this is, we don't want to ignore that a person is not coherent after kind of that 30 seconds and then not be aware of that.
Okay. And is that continuing? If somebody stops being coherent 2 minutes after the carotid hold, is that something that
Yeah,
they're
so
trained to look out for?
yes, they are taught to, kind of keep eyes on and maintain an awareness of the person that they're working with.
Okay. Now, it says in the training here, big caps lock, that this lack of understanding and responding is a medical emergency. And this caps lock medical emergency, I think, is something we'll see a bunch of times this morning. What does that mean for an officer that they should do? If they have this information and something is the caps lock medical emergency, what are they supposed to do about it?
I just lost the screen. I'll answer your question, but I
Well,
just
it goes in and out occasionally.
Oh, okay,
sorry.
okay, I just didn't know. So the idea of medical emergency is just to alert the officers to any first aid protocols, and it all depends on what it is. So the officers would either start first aid, what they know, or they would, call for rescue if it hasn't been done before, or update rescue about something specific if that was called for as well.
Okay. So first aid, if it's something they can do,
Mhm.
call rescue if they haven't been notified, or if they have notified, update them about the condition change. Is that fair?
Depending on the condition, yeah.
Okay. Well, something that's a medical emergency is the kind of condition they would need to update fire about.
I guess you're asking a very general question to all medical emergencies, not to one specific.
Well, I'm asking about
Yeah.
this one.
Yeah. So if the officer were to see stroke-like symptoms, we would want the officer to probably communicate that to the paramedics, because there's different protocols for strokes and there's different tools and
Officer
things
Smith,
that can do that.
sorry, you're
Yeah.
talking about stroke-like symptoms.
Yes.
This slide doesn't mention stroke anywhere, does it?
Look in the, can we go back to the prior? So that specifically, the 30-second rule is a screening for like stroke-like symptoms, and it's in the risks on one of the other slides, but that's what that is specifically screening for. And that came from the Carotid Restraint Institute, that whole procedure we adopted from that thing. So it's specifically looking for that.
Sorry, talked over him there, my mistake. But this training doesn't say stroke-like symptoms. Let's go to slide 9 or page 19 of this, please. Slide in various reformatted ways, something that is repeated over and over and over again in the carotid training?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Why is it that this slide, essentially verbatim, is repeated so many times in carotid training?
So this is what we believe is the best practice that the officers need to follow a procedure depending on what they're presented with. And then where our testing is based off of this slide. So becomes how we test the officers in whether or not they know the proper follow-ups for any of the various outcomes that they can hit.
Okay. So first, let's talk about how this relates to the carotid. Is this the training that they get on how they are supposed to follow up when using the carotid technique?
Yes, this is the format of what the steps that they're to follow in certain presentations that they have. So not every situation is the same. Some people go unconscious, some people don't. Some people go unconscious quickly, some people take longer to regain consciousness. It's so based on what they're thinking, but this is what we want them to know in those situations, and then apply that list. And they are in order, they are important. That is kind of the way that we've designed that curriculum.
So when you say they're in order and they're important, is this what they're tested on specifically in order and all these steps for any time the carotid is used and somebody goes unconscious?
They're tested in this order. Now, so what happens in real life can be different.
I'm focusing on just the test right now.
Yeah, so the test has a situation where the partner, because the instructor tells them when they're back to consciousness, the person never regains consciousness until the check vocal coherency state.
Okay. So let's talk about some of these individual sentences or individual lines in the slide here. So this first one, to take pressure off, gain prone control, and cuff/lay on side. Is this the recovery position that they're trained to put somebody in on their side?
So laying on side refers to the recovery position. From the time that the officer takes pressure off, there is a procedure to get the hands behind the back, get control, get the handcuffs on, and then once we have the handcuffs on, to then get them to their side. So there's a lot of steps between that one line, but yeah, and it also depends on what the person is doing as well. If they're still fighting or not fighting, or conscious or not conscious. I mean, that's a big timeline there that can take, several seconds.
Sure. So I'd like to focus on the recovery position now. It says cuff and lay on slide. Is this part of the recovery position also mean somebody has an unobstructed nose and mouth?
Part of the recovery position puts the person in the best position to not have an obstructed, and it's, what we've been advised by the medical community is the position that we should put folks in. Whether or not it's obstructed or not may not be in our control. If somebody swallowed something, I can put them on the recovery side, and and that may or may not fix the problem, but it puts them in the best position to do so.
Sure. Can you just describe to the jurors what the recovery position that you teach is?
Yeah, so typically we use handcuffs, and then so the person that we would be working with has hands behind their back in handcuffs. We would put them either on their right or left side, and then try and keep them on that side. Generally, we want to try and bend a knee, and if they're able to kind of stay there on themselves, and kind of use their knee to support themselves, the officers don't need to do anything. They could stand there and just watch. If the person is not able to or refuses to go and stay in that position, we teach the officers specifically how to use control holds, how to do things to keep them in that position, to give them the best chance to make a recovery until rescue comes.
Okay, so I want to break down a few details of that recovery position that you train. The first thing you mentioned is on their side, so one shoulder down and the other is up. Can you explain how that differs from somebody who is on their back or who's prone on their stomach?
How those positions are different?
Yeah, can you explain to the jury how you train that those positions are different?
I think I'm missing your question, because they're on their back, they're on their face, or they're on their side. Is that?
Yeah, let me just break them down one by
I'm
one.
just trying to get.
How do you train that the recovery position is different than somebody who's on their back? I'll try my best. Sorry about that. How do you train the officers how do you train the difference between somebody being in the recovery position versus being on their back?
I think I know what you're asking. I want to make sure I answer your question. A person in handcuffs on their back it's called supine, face up. It's very uncomfortable for the person, and there's some issues with their hands being behind their back and them laying on those hands. The person on their side, we already discussed. Person face down, and when we talk about prone control, a person face down is prone. Face up would be supine. Those are the terms that are used. So prone control is once we get to the person where we're getting ready to put handcuffs, we generally put them face down so that it's easier to get them in handcuffs. It's much more difficult for someone to fight in that position. So we use a prone control. There are several control holds that we teach to get that done, depending on which part of the body the officer, if the officer's facing towards the head or facing towards the feet or facing towards the side. So we use that prone control. We have control holds. We put the cuffs on in a manner. And then once those are done and once we have the cuffs on, we will get them to their side. And I think that's what they're referencing. I think that's your question.
Yeah. So
Okay. Yeah.
the prone control
Mhm.
is advised for getting the handcuffs on initially. Is that fair?
Yes.
But then after that, we want them off their stomach and on their side in the recovery position.
Yes.
One of the things that you mentioned was arranging a person's legs so that they don't fall back into that prone position. Is that sometimes called a figure 4 position with the legs?
No, that wouldn't be figure 4. So if you're talking about recovery position, putting the person on their side, so think about yourself being on your side, right, with your hands here. Balance is a little hard. So we just bend your knee and it makes like a little kickstand, right? So you can kind of put that knee out and it kind of holds you up. So if you are in a position to be able to do that on your own, then we can put that there. A figure 4 is completely different. It's when you are dealing with a person who is continuing to fight in handcuffs, to be able to maintain control and then decide whether or not more restraints are needed, like a leg restraint, whether or not the person is kicking, fighting, those kind of things. So the figure 4 is specific leg control to being in prone versus being on the side.
Okay, so am I understanding you correctly to say the figure 4 is used to keep somebody in prone, not to keep them in recovery position and under control?
That particular technique is a prone control technique to control the legs.
Now, the one last thing I wanted to talk about is what benefits do you train the recovery position has for protecting somebody's airway?
Repeat the question. What benefits?
Yeah. Do you train recruits about how the recovery position can help somebody protect their airway?
Yeah, so we say that, or we've been advised, we take advice from the first aid and the medical community that recovery position can help a person keep their airway open as opposed to other positions. And it can dislodge something that's stuck there sometimes. It can prevent somebody from, aspirating vomit. And then we teach about how it gives us, and more importantly, it gives us kind of the ability to look at them and see their condition. And so that we can see a rapid change, we can see something different, whereas somebody in other positions, we wouldn't be able to see that.
Okay. You also train them that the recovery position helps somebody who is in custody be able to expand their chest to breathe and to cough?
So we teach that helps with the open and obstructive and mechanical articulation of the chest walls, right? It's a little easier for the chest walls to move. But I want to make sure that that doesn't mean that it will, right? The recovery position doesn't mean you will recover. It just puts you in the best position to recover. And there are cases where that isn't the best position for you. And, we have specific examples for something like that, but it's just, it doesn't mean that you will recover. It doesn't mean that you will retain all of those positive things. It just puts you in the best position that we know at the first aid level to do.
You mentioned that sometimes there are other positions that you train on that can also be very helpful. Is one of those sitting a suspect up?
Yes.
Is that also considered a form of the recovery position?
We don't typically call that recovery position. That's sort of baseline, when there's not really any indicators of anything going wrong, we get the cuffs on the person, we do a search administratively, we sit them up, or we stand them up, or we take them to the car. That's kind of more sort of administrative function. We don't consider necessarily like seated as a recovery, but let's say a person is like, hey, can I sit up? And they seem to be doing okay. Well, we're fine with that, as long as, the officers are still watching and making sure. But that would be a person who is fairly, we don't see a lot of things that could be an indicator of a medical emergency in that case to do something seated. We do train that sometimes seating someone, especially someone with a high body mass index or a large distended belly, like would have trouble breathing in those seated positions too. So we kind of train that as well. So the officers just need to look at the totality, what's going on, what are they seeing, and then doing the best they can.
So let's focus on the speaker notes for this for a little bit and talk about the checking of vital signs. Now, do you train officers in number 3 here to specifically check for somebody's pulse at the wrist rather than the neck?
We do. In the cases where someone's been, only in the cases where someone's been rendered unconscious with the carotid control hold. Other first aid, that's the first place we would go. But in the uses, after the use of a carotid, we would say, don't start there. Go to a different location. So we do train that when a person has been rendered unconscious and is still unconscious.
Okay. You mentioned that in normal first aid, when somebody is checking pulse, you would teach them to first look at the neck. Is that fair?
Yes, that's just American Red Cross. I mean, we get the same, a police officer has the same training as an office worker when it comes to first aid. And so it's like the Red Cross first aid general, but that's where most people would check for that pulse.
Do you teach the officers any sort of techniques like foot tapping to help them get practice with detecting a pulse?
Yes. So one of the things that we want to do is we recognize these are dynamic situations, and we want to ensure that the officers post carotid control hold technique can actually do it, not just know the thought behind it or not just know, but we don't want them to like think that they know where these locations, especially because we're checking at places that are a little bit more difficult than the carotid artery or the jugular veins. And so we actually start just underneath the bicep here, kind of up under the armpit. There's a place to feel a pulse. So that's what we kind of tell first. And we have the officers actually find their partner's pulse. And so the way we check that is that they actually tap their foot when they catch that pulse. What we're trying to do is make sure that they know the difference between the person's pulse and their pulse. They were just in a confrontation. If they're using this technique, their heart rate is up. We don't want them to feel or not be able to feel it. We also teach the alternative places, why the wrist is not good with handcuffs. You can go to femoral, and if you had to, you could go back up to the neck.
Okay. The second part of this is how you train them to check for breathing. Is that correct? Watching the chest to rise and fall, and then also feel for breathing in front of mouth and nose?
Yeah, with a person who's unconscious, we would say, yep, look, listen, and feel. It's first aid 101. It's, if we, can see that that's occurring, we know that that's happening. And then if we had to, we could, if it was faint or something, we could feel for that. I mean, that's, again, just employing basic first aid in that situation.
Okay. Now, you teach them to look, listen, and feel. because you want to make sure that the person is actually getting good gas exchange. Is that the reason you train them that way?
Well, okay, so you're bringing in another piece that look, listen, and feel wouldn't actually give us an indicator of. So you're talking about gas exchange. We haven't covered that topic yet. Look, listen, and feel would not give you an any indicator of whether or not there was gas exchange. Look, listen, and feel is just sort of and again, if I can see like the person is inhaling and exhaling air, I can see that the person they're moving their chest. It doesn't mean you have to feel. It's a good way to get bit, especially with someone who's conscious. But the idea is that, like, okay, you're just going to employ what you know for first aid in those situations. Do you want to talk about gas exchange?
We'll get to
Okay, I
those
figured.
finer points of breathing a little bit
Okay,
later.
that's a big topic, but I just want to make sure that, like, even look, listen, and feel would not give you any indication of gas exchange.
And I need to make sure you don't speak over one another.
Thank you.
Now let's talk about number 4, the calling of rescue. Now here it says that they're trained to notify specifically that they need rescue hot and for an unconscious party. Is there additional information that they're trained to relay during this call for rescue?
Well, by our policy, this is the language that the policy requires. So if you attempt this technique, you need to call for rescue and you need to let them know. In the case where the person was unconscious, then we would say, and this isn't I know it's in quotes, it's not a verbatim. It can be added to things. A lot of officers just in practice say, I need rescue hot for an unconscious party and a supervisor. Well, supervisor's way low on that list. It's administrative, but there's no harm in saying that at the same time. And so in that, it generally indicates that, it's likely that we use that technique in that call. And so this is just kind of practice and language that we do in real life. We just say, I need rescue hot for an unconscious party. And hot means like, I need you emergent. I need you to come fast, as opposed to just a routine response.
So Officer Smith, I'm really trying to be kind to our court reporter and not cut you off. But if you could just please try and answer the specific question I'm asking. And the question was, is there other information that they're trained to relate as part of this call?
In this PowerPoint, it's not saying this, but we would want them to, give any relevant information that the fire department may need to know, if there's time to do so, and if there's the ability to do so. So, there's lots of situations. So there isn't anything that's structured or whatever, but we would want to, if there was a massive change, if I started chest compressions, I think I would expect the officers to say that.
Do you train them to let fire know that the carotid was used, for example?
Yes.
Another example, if they're having trouble breathing post-carotid, is that something that you train them to get on the air to fire?
We train them to recognize signs of breathing issues, but we don't say specifically, you have to say this or that in those things. Every situation is different. Everybody presents differently. And so it's up to the officers to determine what has already gone out, what else needs to go out, or whether that needs to be communicated when they get on scene or what's shown. So every situation is unique in terms of what is important.
And I'm not talking about the grand spectrum of every situation. Specifically, do you train them that if somebody is having trouble breathing, that needs to be relayed to fire?
I believe the sergeant already just answered this question. This is asked and answered.
All right, I'll allow one more try, I suppose.
So specifically, do you train them that if somebody is having trouble breathing, that's something that needs to be relayed to fire?
We train the signs of breathing. We train officers to recognize that those indicators may be a medical emergency. And if they believe it rises to that level, then they would need to communicate that.
So was that a yes?
It's an in general answer can't be used for a like a situationally specific situation, right?
I'm not asking
So,
hypothetical.
yeah, no, I'm just saying like we can't, so we train that, listen, you need to communicate. If there is something that rises to the level, like, and you believe that it needs to be communicated, then communicate those things. This goes again to basic first aid. What are we saying? But we do not have a list of things that everybody has to absolutely say in any indication. And so the situation is very different. If a person is presenting like they can't breathe and I can see signs of agonal breathing, that's one thing. But if a person's sitting on the curb and we say, do you have any medical conditions? And they say, I have asthma, I don't think that we need to like call fire out and just because they said that they have this pre-existing condition. Do you see what I'm saying? Even though asthma can be, and a complaint of asthma can be an indicator of a breathing issue.
So, Officer Smith, do you remember a couple years back, you had a teleconference over Zoom with some folks from the Attorney General's office?
Yes, I remember.
Okay. Can we please show just the witness, page 87 of the transcript of that teleconference? I'm referring to lines 6 through 11. Now, in this teleconference, you were trying to describe the training that you give with regards to the carotid and other issues that APD may face. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And in that conference, you said, and so we know that there's a difference when they get the call and they say, oh, Aurora used the carotid restraint. We need to come out. They run hot, but they might change. But if they know that the person's having trouble breathing, so we're like, you get that on the air and you get that out, whatever is going on. I read that from your statement correctly, didn't I?
Yes.
Let's go back to the slide that we were just talking about, and I want to focus now on first aid. What sort of first aid training does your average patrol officer receive?
Like I said, it's very similar or the same program as like the kind of American Red Cross first aid training with CPR, and then they also get what's called a trauma casualty care. We call it TCC, and that is like bleeding control. How to apply a tourniquet, how to do pressure therapy just for bleeding wounds and those kind of things in those situations. So they get just basic first aid, and then they get this trauma care for like gunshot wounds.
Okay. Do you train the officers that if there's something that goes beyond the scope of their limited first aid training, that they should relay those problems to the fire department to address?
I got confused on the question. Can you say it again?
Sure. Do you train officers that if something goes beyond what they can handle from their first aid training, to refer that to fire and the paramedics?
If there's something that they can't do based on theirs, to call fire and rescue to assist on that.
Okay. Number 6 on this list is to check for coherency. Is that those questions we were talking about earlier, like what's your name, who's the president type of stuff?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I see search the suspect and leave him on his side as much as possible. Is this the training you give them to try and leave somebody in the recovery position on their side as much as possible?
Yes, after check for coherency, we're more into administrative now. And so you can't search a person thoroughly before we hand them to the fire department and into the ERs to make sure they don't have a weapon on them without moving them a little bit. But there is some, okay, we're now in administrative, we're going to do that search. And then we do have to move them, roll them over, switch them side to side to get pockets that are on the ground at the time and areas of the body that we haven't searched. So, but yeah, that would be sort of the idea is just, okay, now we're in administrative, we're going to do the search. There's a procedure for how to do the search. And
You refer to this as administrative. Are you saying that the training distinguishes between, the sort of administrative cop things versus the medical detained person safety things?
yes, there are.
are the safety concerns the number one priority over these administrative things?
Yes.
Is another one of the administrative things you're talking about calling a supervisor?
Yes.
So let's talk now about 9, the interaction. Actually, could we zoom out here and show the whole slide? So the final thing on the main slide is have the subject checked by the medical staff. Why do you train the officers that it's important to have the subject checked by emergency medical responders?
Well, the policy requires it. So, I mean, anytime that you apply it, the policy requires you, whether or not they go unconscious, to call rescue out and have them assessed at the scene.
Okay. Could we scroll to the next page of the speaker notes from the slide? It's down below this. There we go. Now here, the training says that recruits are to understand that the search and supervisor notifications are administrative functions, and any medical issues supersede the priority of those items. Do you train them that this priority order should be the case throughout their detention of somebody?
Yeah, I mean, that's true of all, custodial care issues. I need to make sure that somebody of traveling somebody in the back of my patrol car to the jail and something goes wrong, I need to make sure that that's taken care of first.
Sure. So do you train them that medical issues take priority over things like passing information up the chain of command or figuring out, what charges may be applicable or something like that?
Yes.
Let's go now to page 20, please. How are officers trained about the importance of communication between them, the officers on scene, and the folks in the ambulance or the folks at the hospital?
Oh, that's pretty general. What do you, yeah.
Sure. So the slide here indicates that it's important to document names, for example. Is that correct?
Yes. We're just giving guidance on officers. Sorry if I interrupted. We're giving guidance on officers to, one of the decisions will have to be made whether or not you ride in the ambulance or follow behind, right? That's a kind of a procedural issue that gets worked out on the scene. And then that it's a best practice to try and get whoever the doctor's name is, whoever the charge nurse or whoever's running that care. So we can just document who they saw in that. And then we also want them to advise when they get to the detention, we just want to say, hey, this person is in our custody. We use this technique. We want you to be notified so that the jail nurse or their staff can be aware of that. And then whatever protocols they have for those kind of things, that's kind of their department.
Okay. So it sounds like you're saying the sort of last step of this is just maintaining good communication from the officers who were involved in the incident all the way through to the hospital or wherever the suspect or the detained person ends up.
Yeah, their responsibility is to notify all those points that the control hold was used and whether or not the person was gone unconscious.
Okay. Let's take a look at the last slide here on page 21. It looks like page 21 slide is the same as the slide on page 19. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you have this slide in this presentation twice at the end because it's just so important?
No, that's pragmatic. Actually, it is important, but it's not specifically designed because when we get to the practical, when everybody comes into the gym, that's sort of the last slide that's up there. They run through and do some practices, and then we put them into their test. So that slide is just pragmatically up there as a reference when we call it blue mat training. Our mats are blue and they come in and actually do physical stuff. When we're on blue mats, it's projected so that there's a reference for the officers in their training to like practice through all of those techniques if they don't, if they need a refresher or the instructor can refer also to them in that training.
Okay. So Is this order of steps what they are then tested on in the blue mat training?
Yes.
And Officer Heineman was kind enough to come and explain to us, what that looks like practically. So I just want to ask you a few questions about the grading. Am I understanding this correctly, that they have to do each one of the steps here in order to pass the carotid training?
In the situation that we present them, we require them to do those steps in order. Yes,
So yes, they have to do each of the steps here in order to pass the training.
correct.
If they skip a step, they would fail the training.
Yeah, if they skip a step, like say with someone who is still unconscious, then yes, they would fail that training. We have several different versions of it. So we have versions where the person gives up and they wouldn't go through those steps, excuse me. There's several different testing points. So it wouldn't be accurate to say that when we are testing the de-escalation piece and the person gives up, that they have to go through all those steps, which is what your question was.
When they're doing the blue mat training
Yes.
for the carotid for somebody who went unconscious, if they skip any of these steps, they would fail the training.
Yes.
If they do any of these steps in a different order, they would fail the training.
Yes.
And if they did any of these steps wrong, they would fail the training.
Correct.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this was from the 2019 in-service, August 2019-ish. Would this have been the first time that Mr. Woodyard went through carotid training that was similar to this?
No.
Would he have gone through a similar training in the academy back in 2016?
Yes.
When you go through that academy training, is that longer, slower, a bit more detailed?
Yes.
In that particular training in the academy, you would have been his instructor,
Yes.
and Officer Heineman would have been his practical testing instructor.
Yes.
Did Mr. Woodyard also go through carotid training in 2017 in service?
Yes.
And you taught that course too?
We haven't talked about any of that, like in terms of exhibits and stuff. So I mean, I am not prepared to answer, like I would taught his course on his day. We haven't seen anything that gives me that kind of a assurance. But
he
I
would've-
was overseeing the training and I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
It's okay. He went through the carotid training in 2017.
Yes.
He also would have done it again during the 2018 in service.
Yes.
And then he would have done it in 2019 as part of becoming a KOGA instructor himself, correct?
Yes.
So Academy, 2017, 2018, 2019 KOGA instructor, and this 2019 training we're just talking about. He would have gone through this at least 5 times?
So like I said, I don't know, I can say 17 because if he graduated in 17, he may not have gone to the 17 class because he wouldn't have been required to do that. He had just got out of the academy. So I mean, we haven't looked at any exhibits that show him in 17, but he took his class, his basic class. He wouldn't have been obligated to teach or to retake it in service in 17. He may have, he may not have. We need to look at those training records, but
Let's
in
show.
18, 19.
Let's show the
If you want to
witness.
make, we're under oath. I got to make sure I got to get it right.
If I start talking, can you just stop, please?
Yes, sir.
Let's show the witness exhibit 204. We could have skipped this whole long thing because I can just show it to you. So exhibit 204 for just the witness, please. Oh, this is the training academy, excuse me. I'll pull up the right one, but it is 10:30. So Judge, while I grab the correct sheet, I would suggest this is a good time to take the morning break.
All right, we'll take our morning break. I'll remind the jurors not to form or express any opinions or discuss the case even amongst themselves. Do no independent research, avoid any press coverage. We could get back together in about 15 minutes. We'll continue with the testimony. CR 2794. Anything before the jury's return? All right. Need to remind folks, unless you're with the staff of one of the attorney's offices, the electronic devices need to be turned off while in the courtroom. Jurors have returned. Please be seated. Mr. Smith is on the witness stand, still under oath. You may continue with your examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Officer Smith, during the break, we were able to review some documents to confirm whether or not Mr. Woodyard also took carotid-related training in 2017.
He did.
Okay. So would that be a total of at least 5 times he's gone through carotid training?
You're going to make me count 17, 18, 19. Are you counting 5?
So 16 academy,
Yes.
17 in service,
Yes.
18 in service,
Yes.
19 in service, and 19 KOGA instructor training.
Yes.
So at least 5?
We got there.
All right. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that KOGA instructor training specifically that Mr. Woodyard went through. How many hours is that?
The entire course is 40 hours. It's over the course of a 1 week block.
What are the different subjects that are covered in that?
So it's the ACT curriculum. So that would be the use of handcuffs, how to like cuffing positions, search positions, overcoming resistance, control holds, and then the carotid control hold, among others.
Okay. After receiving that KOGA instructor certification, would he then be able to lead classes and train others on those techniques?
He'd be able to assist teach. So there's rules on who can be the lead and that depending on what class he's doing, basic versus in-service that. But yes, he would be an instructor for that or could assist in instructing that technique.
Okay. And specifically, would he have been qualified to assist in instructing on the carotid?
Yes.
I'd like to now talk about some more of that arrest control tactics and KOGA training that happened at the academy. Could we please show the witness exhibit 281? Now, Officer Smith, were you able to confirm this morning that this is a class that was given at the 2016 academy in class 2B?
Yes,
And is this a class that you teach?
it is.
This is one that Mr. Woodyard would have taken as part of being in Academy Class 2B?
Yes.
All right. And are these a fair and accurate copy of the slides and the speaker notes?
Yes.
I'd move for admission of People's 281.
Board or objection?
I have a second, Judge. Judge, no objection.
Okay, 281 will be admitted.
Now, this particular training, is this sort of the foundational understanding of what KOGA is and how APD teaches arrest control tactics?
At the basic recruit level, yes.
Okay. Are the subject matter that's covered in here things that Mr. Woodyard would have studied more in depth as later becoming a Koga instructor and through his in-services.
Yes.
Let's please publish this exhibit to the jury, starting with page 27. Now, I pull up my copy of this as well so that I can make this go as quickly as possible. Now, specifically, I want to talk about the slide itself. When it says here in the second sentence, when you put your hands on someone, expect a reaction. Are you training these recruit officers that when they put their hands on somebody, that person might be angry or scared or have some sort of emotional reaction to them?
Yes, in some cases.
Okay. Now, let's look at the speaker notes for this as well. And the speaker notes say down in the third paragraph there, remember that people are hardly going to celebrate when you put your hands on them. Even if they don't choose to fight, they'll still probably react in some way. When you put your hands on someone, expect a reaction. Is this sort of a fundamental truism of policing that you're teaching to these young recruits here?
Yeah, it is.
Let's take a look at page 66. I want to talk about how this training addresses ideas of de-escalation. And let's take a look at the slide itself. In the third paragraph there, it says, once the suspect has complied, you need to reduce the amount of pain they feel. This is called de-escalation of force. Now, can you explain to the jury what you're teaching them about how to deal with a suspect who has complied with the officer's orders or is subdued?
So de-escalation, we kind of teach two prongs, and this addresses the second prong, which is once you've decided that it's reasonable, appropriate to use force, when that force is effective, when you gain control, that you need to de-escalate, right? So you can't just keep doing the same thing over and over unless it's justified all the way throughout. And so this idea here is that once we get compliance, the person has given up, they have they're no longer resisting, they're no longer pulling away, they're no longer fighting, then we, obviously want to de-escalate any sort of pain compliance or use of force that we're applying to the person.
Okay. Let's take a look at the notes for this. Is the idea that you're communicating here is that throughout the interaction with a citizen, the circumstances might change and therefore the appropriate use of force level might also change?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about the example that you use here. It starts in the bottom sentence here, so I think it'll scroll on to the next page. So the example you teach is, consider a scenario where two officers are attacked by a man with a baseball bat. The officers choose deadly force to shoot the suspect with their handguns. Once the suspect falls to the ground and drops the bat, the confrontation isn't over. The officers still need to take the suspect into custody and seek medical attention for the suspect. The officers de-escalate the amount of force that they were using. Is this an example that you train on of how when the threat level changes from being attacked by baseball bat to guy is now shot and no longer has baseball bat, you change the amount of force you're using?
Yes.
Is sort of the key fact that you're training officers on here is that this individual who was attacking them with a baseball bat is no longer a threat, therefore you need to treat them differently?
I would disagree with your characterization. It's not saying that the person is no longer a threat, right? If they drop the bat is, the fear of serious bodily injury or death from the use of that bat may be different than it was when the bat was in his hand versus he can still be combative, he can still assault, he can still do things that, whatever. But your point is true that the officers are trained to recognize that situation changes, and then our reasonability of force and the decisions to use force should also be changing with that information.
That's a really great point, Officer Smith, and thank you for making that distinction in my question. In this example that you're training on, when this person is attacking with a baseball bat, that presents a deadly threat. But then later, he may present some threat, but it's not a deadly threat anymore. Is that the distinction you're trying to make here?
And I don't want to, there are differences of threat levels, right? And there are open-handed, empty-hand threats that can be deadly force, right? Just there are techniques, there are things that a person can do, there are things that can present a deadly force option. So like, not to belabor what you're trying to get at, I think is, yes, things change and they can change from a deadly force to a situation to another, but I don't want to submit that just because a person doesn't have anything in their hands that they can't be a deadly threat to the officers and all of those, which just splitting hairs on your question, sorry.
And I'm not asking about every situation under the sun. I don't want to get into hypotheticals with you. I just want to talk about this example you're training on. In this example, after this person has been shot and doesn't have a bat, the point you're trying to train on is that they're no longer a deadly threat in this one specific situation.
So again, using this as an example, if the person gets shot that was wielding a bat and threatening the officers feloniously, and we use deadly force in that situation, and then the officers present, that person can still access another weapon in their waistband, go to a pocket for a knife. So like, it wouldn't be true to say, even in this situation, that person couldn't present as a lethal threat. But the point is, does the situation change? And when the officer's perception is that no longer becomes a lethal threat, they should change their force? Yes, of course.
Sure. Is the point you're making here that they shouldn't just keep shooting the guy?
Yes.
And that's because he's dropped the bat and there's not a current indication of a deadly threat from him.
Objection, Judge. Leading.
Response?
It's foundational to clarify the testimony.
All right, I'll allow it in this instance.
Is that because he's dropped the bat and isn't currently presenting a deadly threat?
The bat, because he's dropped the bat and it's no longer in his proximity, the officer should not be concerned that the bat is a threat. If he goes back to the bat, it becomes the threat. So that goes back up. If he accesses another weapon, it goes back up. But right, a person who collapses, doesn't move, drops the bat, yes, we would no longer, the officer's perception would no longer be a deadly threat until the suspect does something differently.
I appreciate that clarification. So let's go to page 117. I promised we'd talk about some of this breathing stuff, so now we can jump into a little bit of it. Now, the slide here says breathing requires 3 elements: gas exchange, unobstructed airway, and muscular or mechanical ventilation. Can you just briefly explain to the jury how you would explain this to one of the officers you were teaching it to?
Yeah, so we need officers to understand signs and symptoms of apneic breathing. We want them to be aware of those so that we can get help when it's necessary. We use, this is just a very basic level of, we want officers to understand that there's 3 things that you need for respiration, 3 things total. And one of those is an open and unobstructed airway. So we want to make sure that air is able to move past, right? If you swallow a ping pong ball, air's not going to be able to go. If you choke on some food. And again, that's basic first aid. The other thing is you have to have mechanical articulation of the chest. So the body has to have ability to breathe with that mechanical articulation. If a semi rolls over a person's chest, they are no longer able to move that body. So that's kind of part of that as well. The last part is gas exchange. And so you can have an open and unobstructed airway. You can have mechanical articulation of the chest. But if gas exchange isn't occurring, a person can still be in an agonal breathing situation. And so, and what we teach the officers is at our level, there's no physical way to determine whether or not that's occurring. You need we affectionately call it the ET finger. You need that pulse ox. And so someone else has to do that. But what we want to recognize is that a person can have an open and obstructed airway, can have mechanical articulation, and still have breathing issues because they're not getting that gas exchange.
All right. Let's talk about the next slide on page 118. And talk about what are you telling officers about how the chest wall and the diaphragm and the muscles of the rib cage interact to allow somebody to breathe?
Yeah, so we just basic physiology. The chest needs to be able to allow oxygen to go into the lungs. The diaphragm pulls a vacuum in the lungs. It's just very simple baseline. You need that function in order to do it. Again, if a person was under, a car, that would be very difficult for a person to breathe. And so that's why we need that sort of that mechanical, that a person would need that to be able to complete all three of those.
And when you say that mechanical, are you training them essentially that the chest needs to be able to expand so all these different things can work together to breathe?
Yes, the lungs need to be able to pull oxygen into them without getting too far into the woods. The lungs need to be able to hold oxygen. If the chest as well is compressed so much so that it can't, then that becomes an issue.
Okay. And then the last word on the slide is hypoxia. Is that what you're training them results if somebody can't get this mechanical ventilation to breathe?
Yeah, just a very 30,000 foot level of this idea that if the gas exchange does not occur, then that can become a medical emergency for them.
Okay. And do you train them that hypoxia just means shortage of oxygen in the body?
Depending on the class, and we've referenced several different classes, depending on the class, it doesn't get much further than that, but it could be either oversaturation of carbon dioxide or lack of oxygen inside. It can have several different things, but we don't go too far in with police officers. We just need them to understand that this gas exchange is important. Oxygen has to come in, carbon dioxide has to come out.
All right. Let's take a look at the next slide on page 120. Or excuse me, 119. Now, the slide here says placing someone on their stomach makes it more difficult for the chest wall, diaphragm, and muscles of the rib cage and abdomen to work properly, inhibiting the intake of fresh oxygen. Is this position on the stomach that you're referring to here what you also refer to in training sometimes as a prone position?
So, yeah, prone, so not to confuse the terms, prone is just a position of the body. It's just a person face down. When you're sleeping on your stomach, you're in prone. Prone control is the application of police tactics in that position to get you into handcuffs in general. So yes, what we're basically saying in this slide is that a person who lays flat, because what we teach is that the chest wall generally moves forward of the body, and that if that's inhibited, it can make it a little bit harder. It can do those kind of things as opposed to laying on your back. At the time, and this would have been 2016, studies have changed a lot, especially with COVID and everything. So like the idea of prone face down being dangerous is all over the board.
Sorry.
But we taught that at the time, yes. At this time, we were teaching that was what the medical community was telling us. And so what we recognized from that is, yes, we use prone control. Let's get them to their side as soon as it's practical to do so.
Okay. Let's take a look at the next slide, page 120. Is this slide that talks about further complication is that violent exertion like that during a fight can result in a state of metabolic acidosis. Is this a further complication from those breathing problems that you train the officers on?
Yes, we want officers to recognize that if a person continues to fight in restraints, they can exert themselves. There's an exhaustive component to this where the person can literally put themselves in danger by continuing to fight, even in restraints. And all this is an exasperation of that basic concept of gas exchange, right? The exertion amplifies the issues that could be present.
Okay. And in the second paragraph, it says the resulting metabolic and respiratory acidosis can lead to a state of shock and metabolic distress, resulting in a downward spiral of the subject's medical condition that can result very rapidly in death. Are you teaching officers about this to highlight the urgency that these concerns can create?
Yes.
Let's take a look at the speaker notes for this. Now, start on the fourth line there. The resulting combination of respiratory and metabolic acidosis can lead to a situation where the subject's situation deteriorates so quickly that recovery can be impossible and death can result. Even someone who is simply struggling to get free of his or her handcuffs is exerting energy. But a fight with a truly committed suspect requires an extraordinary amount of exertion by both the officer and the suspect. Exertion of this level taxes the body and can produce the metabolic acidosis that we have been discussing. How are you training them that this is related to those breathing concerns that we were just talking about?
One, we want officers to recognize symptoms as early as possible. Like, we can't wait for those. And so when we do see those, then we want to engage the first aid that we have available to us. Generally, that first aid is calling for rescue and, if needed, CPR. Current CPR, we don't teach the breathing anymore. That's not part of first aid anymore. But basically, chest compressions would be sort of that piece of it. So we need to recognize that the sooner we can get a medical intervention, the sooner that we can get the people who have the tools available on scene to let them do their job, the better off everyone is, especially for the safety of the subject and the officers.
Are you training the officers that good breathing is necessary to clear this metabolic acidosis or this acidotic state?
I don't know if those words are in the training, but I think the principle of, like, people are generally better when they're breathing normally, right? We generally are in better states is not lost. So yes, I mean, but those words are not specific to the training, but that's where it's pointing.
Do you use sort of everyday examples with people when you do these trainings? Like, if you're running a really long distance and you've got that acid buildup in your system, that's why you're huffing and puffing to help clear that. Do you use examples like that in your training?
Yeah, we understand the pragmatics of exertion and recovery, and in sport and in survival. We understand those concepts and teach those. Yes.
Okay. Let's take a look at the slide right after this, 121. Now, we've sort of been looking at all these slides in order. In the second line here, where it says laying a person on their stomach with their hands cuffed behind their back simply amplifies this condition. The condition you're referring to in these slides, is that what we were just talking about, those breathing problems and the acidosis?
Well, I think this line is referencing the positional asphyxia. It's the position of the body that creates inhibitors to breathing, right? And so that line specifically is referencing positional asphyxia. Positional asphyxia is something that we have to deal with in how to get people into handcuffs. And so, yes, it's all related, but that's what that one is specifically relating to.
Okay, let's take a look at the speaker notes too. Talking about how to deal with, in the second paragraph, the third line, if you have to leave a handcuffed prisoner lying on the ground, try to keep that prisoner on his or her side as much as possible. Are you training them basically to be using sort of the recovery position here to prevent these sorts of problems we're talking about?
So If you can, yes. If you can, if it is possible to get them on their side. Now, keeping someone on their side who doesn't want to be there is very difficult. And if the person becomes combative and assaultive to the officers, kicking, fighting, and, then you may have to go to traditional control, like may have to go back to prone, which goes to figure 4, like we said, and trying to get leg restraints on. And so if you can, and it's possible to keep them there, we do teach that like try to get them as quickly as possible. Try to keep them there if you can. We teach them control holds and a playbook of how to deal with that. And then at a point when it comes too violent, what to do next.
Okay. So is this training trying to communicate the idea that leaving somebody on their stomach while they're handcuffed with their hands behind their back can prohibit good breathing?
It can. Yeah, the training is designed to teach them that, like, person's not fighting, everything is okay, they're in handcuffs, we're not just gonna leave them face down, in and of themselves, right? We want to get them to their side or seated or standing or in the back of a patrol car as best we can.
Or,
But but it's clear that we're training, we don't leave people face down for an extended period of time unless there's a reason to do so.
let's move to the very next slide, 122. And the third line, get the restrained person out of the prone position, preferably onto their side or in a seated position. Are you training them to do this whenever it's practicable and safe to do?
Yes.
Let's take a look at the next slide in this, page 123. And the first bullet point there is, understand that this condition can occur so quickly that the subject cannot be revived. Are you training them on this to communicate the urgency that these concerns raise?
Yes.
Are you training them that even a very short time with insufficient oxygen can be really dangerous to somebody's health?
Well, I mean, not specifically that statement. We are training them that from our perspective, without medical equipment, we have no idea what's going on inside the person. And we can't control whether the person exerts themselves or doesn't exert themselves, whether they're fighting, what pre-existing conditions they have, all of those things. And so because we are at a loss for all the information, we just want to recognize that here's the best information we have to try and get them their side, try and keep them on their side, go to a better level of control if we need to, if it becomes violent or combative. I mean, so it's that idea that, like, we can't just ignore a situation.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the speaker notes from this one. You use another example in these speaker notes. And you say in the first paragraph, just the first paragraph is fine. Talk about the others in a minute. There are documented instances or documented cases where, and then kind of skipping through some of the description in the fifth line, the suspect had been yelling, making threats, or struggling with his or her restraints, and the suspect became quiet. And the officers figured that the suspect had simply calmed down. In fact, the suspect was laying in the back of the car, dying as a result of hypoxia and whatever other drugs, injuries, exertion, etc. they were suffering from. And even rapid medical attention was not enough to save these suspects. Do you train officers about how important this change from somebody who is active to somebody who suddenly becomes calmed down and quiet can be a sign of danger? Is that why you give them these examples?
Yeah, sudden change in a person's demeanor can be an indicator that something is going wrong, right? We've all been in foot chases with someone. They get in the back of the car, they fall asleep. And that's very common with like an adrenaline dump type situation, but we don't want to mistake something like that for something that is recognizing that a person is actually in a medical crisis.
What I'm hearing you say is that because police officers don't have all the information, you train them to be aware of what they can see, like these changes in demeanor. Is that fair?
Yes.
Let's take a look at the next paragraph in the speaker notes here, talking about some examples from, how do you pronounce this individual's name?
Dr. Reyes.
Dr. Reyes? Who's Dr. Reyes?
This is a while back. I'm not familiar with that study. We don't teach the particular language right now, so
Okay.
I can't answer that right now.
Sure. So at various points in time, it sounds like you've relied on different scientific studies to sort of
Yes.
explain to police officers why this is an important concept.
Yes.
Let's talk about this particular study and what you relate to the recruits.
Yes.
Instructors must stress vigilance in monitoring the subject's condition. The process of hypoxia is insidious, and the subjects may not exhibit any clear symptoms before they simply stop breathing. Generally, it takes several minutes for significant hypoxia to occur, but it can happen more quickly if the subject has been violently active and is already out of breath. If the subject experiences extreme difficulty breathing or stops breathing altogether, officers must take steps to resuscitate them and get medical care immediately. Is this another sort of teaching, like, I guess the point I'm getting at is it useful to refer to these studies to help explain concepts to recruits?
We rely on studies, and the medical community is constantly changing in terms of what's the most latest study that comes out, and so it can be very different depending on but we rely on those to just give officers the best. We are not PhDs, we are not medical doctors, we are, practical folks who go out there and try and do the best we can helping people. And in those situations, I mean, it's just important to understand that these things can happen very quickly. And so it's designed just to give the officers the indication that, hey, call rescue out as soon as you can. Provide first aid if you have to. Those kind of, it really just pushes to the idea that, like, you need to get the people on the scene who can handle those situations as fast as possible. Don't wait for something to go tragically wrong, right? Before you call those resources out.
Let's talk about the final takeaway sentence from this slide at the bottom, the fourth paragraph. Seek medical attention, the final sentence.
Before we do that, can you approach? All right, I'm going to have my judicial assistant take you back to the jury room for just a moment. We'll bring you right back in just a couple of minutes. Don't form or express any opinions or discuss the case. Do no research. Avoid any press coverage. All right, the jurors have stepped out. I'm going to specifically instruct the witness, when you're asked a question, just answer the question. If counsel needs elaboration, they will ask you for elaboration. Many questions you've answered have gone on for minutes when the specific question was perhaps a one word answer. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Bring the jurors back. Okay. All right, the jurors have returned. Please be seated. You may continue with your examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to focus just on the last sentence there on this slide. Seek medical attention at the first sign of a problem and make sure the prisoner is in a position that maximizes his or her ability to breathe. When you say, when the training refers to this position to maximize the ability to breathe, are we talking about a position like the recovery position or a seated or standing position?
Yes.
Now, if we could please show just to the witness, I want to change to another training here. Exhibit 216, a de-escalation training from the Aurora Police Department Academy. Officer Smith, were you able to verify this week that Mr. Woodyard attended this de-escalation training while at the APD Academy?
There it is. Yes.
Was that while you were an instructor at the academy?
Yes.
And are these slides that were provided from the APD, is the substantive content of them a fair and accurate representation of how APD trains de-escalation?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd move for admission of People's Exhibit 216.
Questions or objections?
No objection, Judge.
216 may be admitted.
May we publish to the jury, Your Honor?
Okay.
Let's take a look first at page 1 here, and then let's just click over to page 2. Can you explain to the jury, Officer Smith, why it is that APD teaches de-escalation is so important?
We think that de-escalation is a very important concept for police officers to understand. We want to train them in the best tools, tactics we can so that they can reduce the intensity of the situation, maybe not have to use force or use lesser force. And it's also required by the state to do so.
A little bit ago, we saw some of the slides from Koga that says, when you put your hands on somebody, don't expect them to celebrate, and that you should expect a reaction. Is avoiding negative reactions like that one of the reasons you train de-escalation is so important?
So if an officer has to put hands on somebody, you're making a connection to the de-escalation training or not having to?
Is one of the reasons that you teach de-escalation to avoid situations where a citizen might have a bad reaction to somebody putting their hands on them unless it's necessary?
Yes.
Let's take a look at page 10. The definition of de-escalation here, defined as the reduction in magnitude, volume, or intensity of a conflict. For the purposes of directives, de-escalation is the member using actions, words, posture, presence, and/or lack of presence to attempt to reduce the level of a subject's resistance to the member, and thereby the member's response to resistance. The words lack of presence there are highlighted in yellow on this slide. Is that part of the training to point out that not everything requires physical presence from officers?
That part of the training is to illustrate that there are certain circumstances where the officer's positioning, their geographical location to the person may be an issue in that case. So the officers can use the tool of distance or of not talking to somebody through a door instead of having to open the door to talk to them, having to do some of those type of things. So yeah, that's what that's trying to bring attention to.
Okay, let's take a look at slide 42, the definition of the opposite of escalation. An increase in the intensity or seriousness of something, an intensification.
I'm going to object. This is testifying. What he's doing is reading. So, sorry. This would be testifying, and also it's compound.
Response.
And Judge, I need to highlight what I am going to ask him about.
Well, it's up on the screen, so yeah, if it's been admitted into evidence, you can probably ask him the question without reading the script.
All right. Is this the definition of escalation that the Aurora Police Department teaches its trainees?
Yes.
Let's talk about some of the purposes underlying de-escalation and go to page 18. Why do you train that de-escalation is so important?
Safety for everybody around would be the simplest answer. We want it to be safe for the people. We want it to be safe for the officers. We want it to be safe for bystanders. And if we can employ a tactic and we're in a position to do so, that reduces the level of, intensity of that event, and we can do so safely, then officers should consider that. It's a tool in the toolbox that we can use when it's appropriate to do so.
Well, Officer Smith, more than just a tool in a toolbox, the APD directives, don't they require de-escalation whenever it's practicable?
That's, yes, that the qualifier of that when it's practical or practicable is that essentially the idea that if this technique, tactic, tool can be used in your situation, consider using that when you can. There are other tactics. So it is a tool to use in situations where it's appropriate. And the policy says when practical.
You said consider using this tool, but don't the policies say that if de-escalation is practical, you must use that one tool of de-escalation first?
The consideration would be in the practicality. The officers have to see whether or not it's practicable for them to do that and then do that. If a person's pointing a gun,
Non-responsive, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Officer Smith, I said, when practical. So we are already assuming it is practical. APD training and policies say that you don't just consider de-escalation, but that you must de-escalate. Is that correct?
yes.
Thank you. Let's go now to page 27. Where it says slow down here, are you training officers that it's important not to rush things when you don't have to?
When you don't have to, yes.
Is the purpose of this that you're training officers here to give people time to listen to each other and understand each other?
Could be one of the goals.
Let's now change topics, and I want to talk about in custody death and excited delirium. Can you explain to the jury why in custody death is an important topic that you train recruits on?
Well, anytime there's a death in the process of arrest or while in custody, it's a tragic event and we want to avoid that as much as possible. So there's the humanity side. We are also, and it's in everyone's best interest to try and prevent that as much as possible. Any way that we can, give the best training tools and tactics for the officers on the scene. And then it's also, there's federal mandates that we report those kind of things to the federal government.
Okay. Is the goal of this training to teach officers how to keep somebody safe when they've been detained?
Yes.
When people are detained?
Yes.
Are they taught about some of the biggest, most predictable dangers to people in custody so they can avoid those?
Some of them, yes.
Well, I obviously can't expect them to be trained on every danger, but the biggest and most common ones, those are the ones that they're trained on?
The ones that should concern us, yes.
Could we show just the witness, please, Exhibit 205? Now, is this the front page of a 2017 in-service class?
Can you go to the next page, please?
One page. Screens pop out? So Ryan, should you go back to the first? Is that the only that you have? Oh, okay. Can you show the second page of the PowerPoint? There we go. Okay, go back to the first page of the PowerPoint. Officer Smith, is this a 2017 fourth quarter in service on in custody death?
Yes.
And was this a training that you taught?
Yes.
Did you have an opportunity before coming in today to confirm that Mr. Woodyard attended this training?
Yes.
And is this a fair and accurate depiction of the slides and notes that were taught as part of that training?
It is.
Your Honor, I move for admission of People's 205.
Questions or objections to 205?
No objection, Judge.
205 may be admitted.
Let's start off on page 14. Now here is the purpose of this slide in the training to warn officers about the risks of sudden death from some of these conditions. Oh, could we display this? Thank you.
Yes.
Now, we see here both positional or postural asphyxia, and then on the bottom, restraint asphyxia. Are these two different terms to describe how somebody's body position can cause breathing problems?
Yes.
And specifically in restraint asphyxia, is the training focused on how a police officer's restraint techniques can sometimes prevent adequate chest wall, abdominal, and diaphragm movement?
How certain restraint techniques, yes.
Sure. And you want to train officers how to avoid those dangerous techniques, right?
Yes.
Let's go to page 15. Now, in the first paragraph of the slide here on page 15, we talk about placing someone on their stomach, making it more difficult for them to breathe. Is this one of the techniques that you train officers to avoid unless they have to use it for something like prone control?
Yes.
Similarly, on the bottom, it talks about laying a person on their stomach with their hands cuffed behind their back. And then we've got a section all in caps. Why is that section all in caps?
Because it's important.
Do you also train the officers, especially in that last bullet point there, about how somebody who's been exerting themselves is amplifying the dangers here?
Yes.
Let's now take a look at page 26. Can you explain to the jury why, if you can talk, you can breathe, is a myth?
So the phrase, if you can talk, you can breathe, is very pervasive in sports, in athletics. It's a term that we all sort of grew up, those that were around that kind of thing, hearing and believing. And the problem with the term is that it can disarm you to some issues. So we have already discussed, the three things that are taken, that it takes to respirate. And basically the gist of this is that it only takes an open and unobstructed airway and a mechanical articulation of the lungs to be able to talk. So you can talk, but you may not be getting gas exchange. This, we teach this as a myth because we want to remove that from sort of the psyche that would disarm an officer from believing, well, if you can talk, you can breathe. And they would know that a person could be talking, but may still also have an issue with the breathing.
Let's go to slide 27. There's this story from the LA Times depicted on the slide here, where in the final sentence, they're talking about this individual in custody. Why do you use this as an example of why there is that myth? If you can talk, you can breathe.
I think that this example displays an attitude of an officer that could be indifferent in the situation where someone is actually having a medical emergency, but still being able to say words. And so it's an example to illustrate the point.
Okay. You mentioned that this is an example you train to depict sort of indifference. Is the idea to train officers not to be indifferent to complaints like the ones in this slide? I can't breathe, I can't breathe.
I'm going to object. This is their expert witness. I'm objecting to leading questions.
Response.
That did not suggest an answer. I'm asking if this is one of the purposes of the training.
All right, I'll overrule the objection.
So is one of the purposes of this training slide to teach officers not to be indifferent to statements like the ones in here? I can't breathe, I can't breathe.
Yes.
Let's go to slide 28, please. Now, in slide 28, is the purpose of this slide to sort of explain the body function underlying why, if you can breathe, or if you can talk, you can breathe as a myth?
Yes.
Let's go to slide 30. Why are you teaching officers that any complaint regarding the ability to breathe is serious?
Because it may be an indicator that something's wrong.
And you highlighted that word may there. Are you getting at the fact that, an officer isn't a doctor themselves, but you need somebody to take a look at it?
Yes.
Is it correct to say that you're training officers that even one complaint of somebody saying, I can't breathe, is something that needs to be taken seriously and addressed?
We're training that it can, not in all cases. It's totality of circumstances, but a complaint can be an indicator that they need to call for help.
And I want to be specific about what I'm asking here. I'm not asking for a medical opinion about whether that actually is something that's medically occurring. But are you training officers that even one complaint of being unable to breathe is something that needs to be followed up on?
No, we are saying.
So you gave sworn testimony in a proceeding a few weeks ago, didn't you?
I did.
And in that proceeding, you were under oath.
I was.
You were,
I'm going to object. I'm sorry. This is improper impeachment. He's trying to explain the statement when he was cut off. I don't believe this is appropriate for impeachment at this point.
All right, well, I'll allow him to take a look at the transcript.
you were sitting in that same seat you're sitting in,
Yes, sir.
talking to a different jury,
Yes.
and you told that jury you were going to tell them the truth.
Yes.
All right, please show the witness page 120, lines 20 to 23 of that testimony. Lines 20 to 23. I believe it's the PM. Now, sir, when you were asked under oath in that prior proceeding at line 20 to 23, Well, your own training says, I can't breathe, said one time, may be a sign or a symptom of respiratory failure, right? And your answer was yes. That's correct, isn't it?
I can have a second, Judge. Judge, I'm gonna object. This is fairly misleading. In his statement, just.
And Judge, if we want to get into speaking objections, I would suggest that we approach, but I think that the impeachment is very clear. He said no to my question and he said yes last week.
There's a different question as to what he was asked, is my point. That's what I was trying to.
Why don't we approach? Try to get to the page.
So Officer Smith, in addition to that quote that I just showed you, let's back up and talk about the whole course of the discussion that happened there. So can we please show the witness all of page 120 from that prior testimony? In the first question, you're asked, someone complaining, being unable to breathe over and over again. You certainly would characterize that as important information that you can convey to the paramedics as well. And you answered yes to that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Then you were asked, as a matter of fact, you train officers in your training at the Aurora Police Academy. in the in-service for officers who are already on the job that somebody saying, I can't breathe, even one time, is a sign of respiratory failure, right? And your answer was, may include, so it can be. It says may include. It is not that it is respiratory failure. It may be a sign of respiratory failure. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Then we already read the line right below that where it says, your own training says, I can't breathe, said one time, may be a sign or a symptom of respiratory failure, right? And your answer to that was yes. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the final question on this page is, and respiratory failure means a person can't breathe, right? And then your answer on the next page, 121, is respiratory failure means that there's some component of breathing that the person can't. That's a medical question. I think honestly, we're getting into metabolics now, but I don't disagree.
Judge, let me
If-
interject. This is beyond what he was asked originally. This is now just reading past testimony.
All right, I'm going to allow council to finish with that paragraph.
And your answer continues. If they say they can't breathe, we want to take that as a real, honest complaint, even if they say it one time. And we want to address that with first aid and updating rescue if we need to say that that complaint is there, along with any other things that the officer feels is important to them to communicate. That was your sworn testimony, correct?
Yes.
So according to your sworn testimony that we just read, even one complaint of somebody saying they can't breathe, you train officers to treat as a real, honest complaint.
Yes.
You train officers that if they say that even one time, you want to both address that with first aid and update rescue, right?
Yes.
Let's now go back to Exhibit 205, page 31. Are you training officers here to recognize the signs and symptoms of somebody who is having trouble breathing?
Yes.
Are some of those signs that somebody feels like they can't breathe in enough air?
Yes.
Are you training officers that somebody who feels that way might be saying things like, I can't breathe or I can't breathe correctly?
Yes.
Let's take a look at page 32. Is this a training describing more of the symptoms that you train officers on to look for somebody who has breathing problems?
Yes.
That second line there, 1 to 2 word sentences may indicate breathing issues. Are you training them to look for that as a sign of somebody who might have breathing problems?
Yes.
In the third paragraph, you talk about exaggerated use of muscles to inhale and exhale. Is that like a physical sign that you're training officers to look for as a sign that someone might have breathing problems?
Yes.
That physical sign, are you training them that it's really like literally somebody sort of struggling to try and breathe?
Yeah, we teach that sometimes when someone is in a significant breathing issue, that sometimes that air hunger can create an over exaggeration of the throat, and you can see those muscles contracting, trying to get air in.
Let's talk about page 33. Are these some additional signs that you're training officers to look for to recognize signs of respiratory distress?
Yes.
Now, this last one here, rapid breathing or shortness of breath, is one of the reasons you train officers to monitor breathing to notice things like this.
What was the question?
Is one of the reasons you train officers to monitor breathing so that they will recognize signs like rapid breathing or shortness of breath?
Judge, I'm sorry, I'm going to object again. Again, this is their expert witness. They're not allowed to just limit him to yes or no. These are leading questions.
And it does-
Response.
I said, is it? It doesn't suggest an answer, so it's not leading. And I am really trying to keep this from being a 6-hour direct. And so I'm trying to ask very focused questions rather than.
All right, the court will find that the question is not leading and go ahead.
Is one of the reasons that you train officers to monitor breathing so that they will notice things like rapid breathing or shortness of breath.
Yes.
Let's talk about page 34. Is this slide training officers about some of the signs that somebody might be deteriorating due to breathing or respiratory problems?
Yes.
And does this list different signs of that deterioration, like sudden quiet or loss of strength?
Signs that could be. Yes.
Let's take a look at page 35, the next page. Why are the words medical emergency written in all caps and bright red on this slide?
Because it's important.
Let's take a look at page 36. Is the training that these officers receive that they're supposed to treat all breathing difficulties as medical emergencies?
Yes.
Is part of treating it as a medical emergency that they are trained, they need to communicate that medical emergency to the fire department?
If it rises to a medical emergency, yes.
And any sign that there is difficulty breathing would be a sign that this is a medical emergency, right?
This goes back to the other question. It's not any sign. Some signs are more important than others. One sign may be treated as a medical emergency. It can also be explained another way. For instance, if I'm in a foot chase and somebody says, I can't breathe, we give them the opportunity to calm down and get their strength back. And that is not a medical emergency. That's an explainable event on one of those symptoms.
Now, I'm talking specifically about this training here, though. And the training says specifically that complaints about breathing are signs of medical emergency. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the training says that breathing difficulties are medical emergencies. Is that correct?
Says to treat them as a medical emergency.
Right. And the way that they're treated as medical emergencies is to communicate that information to the paramedics.
Action, Judge. That's leading.
Sustain.
If something is a medical emergency, are officers supposed to communicate that medical emergency to the paramedics?
Yes.
I'd like to talk about the excited delirium section of these slides. Let's talk about page 61. Now, this training, what is this training communicating to officers about how struggling and resistance can indicate an immediate medical emergency that takes precedence over criminal prosecution?
This slide references the curriculum on excited delirium and agitated states. And so it references an entire list of behavior cues that we train officers to recognize. And those behavior cues in those events are, so it's addressed, this slide is addressing those behavior cues, and that struggling and resistance can indicate that it's an immediate medical emergency.
Is this training also talking about that prioritization we've talked about before? That medical distress is more important than concerns related to criminal prosecution or administrative matters?
Yes.
Let's take a look at the next slide. Is this slide training officers that just because somebody is struggling, that doesn't mean that they're committing a crime?
Yes.
Do you train officers about examples, like if somebody's struggling to try and breathe or throw up? Is that something you train them on?
Say the question again.
Do you train the officers on specific examples of this, like somebody who is trying to breathe or trying to throw up?
Yes.
Let's take a look at page 67. Now, is this a slide related to the excited delirium training that Aurora Police Department gets?
Yes.
Does this depict sort of the path that is expected to happen in an excited delirium case?
Yes. This is a model adopted from the Institute for the Prevention of In-Custody Deaths.
Do you train officers that things start in the top left with investigation here?
No, that would be the last step. So assessment would be the beginning step.
Okay, so things start at the top with assess,
Yes, sir.
and then they move down through these different phases, and the person receives sedation?
That's not what we teach, but that model indicates that sedation may be a part of that process, and then we highlight what that means for our cops.
You don't treat them that the individual is going to be sedated in excited delirium?
No. We teach them that the fire department has a protocol and they use their protocol. We make a hard line after the restraints that transfer of care goes. The next slide illustrates that it's a different policy, a different division that handles that. But we are a part of assisting in whatever treatments they feel are necessary.
Sure, and maybe our misunderstanding is coming from who's doing the sedation. Now, the Aurora Police don't do the sedation, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so this phase is done by the Aurora Fire Department.
Only if they deem it's necessary.
Okay, but officers are aware that in excited delirium cases, this is how things are supposed to go and end in sedation.
No, it's not. Your characterization is that this is the way it goes every time, and that's not the case in training or in practice.
Okay, well, let's take a look at that next slide you were mentioning on page 72. You train the officers on the Aurora Fire Protocol to give sedatives, correct?
We don't train them on the protocol. We train them, they have a protocol. And the point of that is to draw a hard line after that restraint, that part of this process may include whatever the fire department decides to do. We don't have a hand in that, but it points to this is their policy, their training, and then this is, but we are still involved in sort of the restraint piece while they do whatever medical treatment they feel is necessary. And then we have responsibilities after all that occurs when the person goes to the hospital, and then we have the investigation.
You train APD officers that this is the protocol AFR follows, is that correct?
That was the protocol at the time of that training, yes.
Right. And this is an older one, so it references midazolam or Versed. Are you aware that by 2019 that had been replaced with ketamine in these protocols?
Yes. Actually, you asked me if I was aware in 2019 that had been replaced.
If you're aware now that in 2019, in this protocol, Versed is replaced with ketamine.
I'm aware that there may have been a change. I don't know the timing of it, so just to be accurate.
Okay. But this fire protocol that you train APD officers on, don't you train them that in excited delirium cases, fire must administer those chemical sedatives?
No.
Where on here does it say fire may choose not to do the things on the protocol?
It references that they have a policy that they follow, that we don't have a hand in whatever policy they follow. And whether they choose to or not to is solely on their autonomy. That the officers will assist in whatever medical treatments that are prescribed at the time or whatever they decide to do, that we can, are a part of the overall response to someone who is very violent. But we draw the hard line. The whole point is, in that slide, is that, listen, that this is the hard line. This is where the fire department's protocols and procedures take over. You let them do what they're going to do, and then we help with arranging the transport, the investigation, and that.
So when you say you let fire do what they're going to do, you mean let fire follow this protocol, correct?
Let fire follow whatever protocol they have. The point is to illustrate, the point of the slide is to illustrate that the fire department has their own set of policies. We do not train officers in that training that we gave. We did not train officers what those policies were. We trained them that they have their own set of rules that they do on how they handle those calls.
Their own set of rules, which you have duplicated for reference by APD, right?
Judge, no matter how many times this question is asked, the sergeant has been consistent. This is asked and answered.
Sustain.
Let's go to slide 67. Does this slide depict any sort of off-ramp from the sedation here?
The slide depicts a model that was developed by the foremost institute in the nation on what is the best practice, including police and firefighters.
Unresponsive.
Judge, I think that's a fairly misleading question. He has to explain why.
Overruled.
So officer, where, if anywhere, does this slide describe an alternative other than sedation?
That slide is a picture. The person in the room teaching the class makes that distinction.
Now, let's talk about
A good time to break.
lunch, sir. I was going to switch slides, so this is a great time to take a lunch break, Connor.
All right, folks, we'll take our lunch break at this time. Please recall, don't form or express any opinions, discuss the case, do no independent research, avoid any press coverage. And I'm going to ask that you try to be back at about 20 minutes after 1 o'clock. I'd like to have you back up right about that time. All right, jurors have stepped out. When space stepped down, if you could be back right about 20 after 1 o'clock, please. Anything before we break?
No, thank you, Judge.
All right, court will be in recess.